Hi, welcome to session 3 of the seventh topic of the semester, the New Republic from 1783 to 1850. Now, in this third session, we're going to be moving now into the initial years of the Republic itself. We already examined in session 1 and session 2 the the creation of the United States with two constitutions, the Articles of Confederation, which really created a confederation, an alliance of independent states with a democratic system of government that vested all powers in the states and in the towns, and the people were participating directly in the decisions of their own localities. They were attending assemblies and raising their hands to casting votes directly. Again, very much involved. So we look at that and how that experiment, of course, comes to an end by 1786, 1787, again, due to Daniel Shays' rebellion. Again, this is going to be the moment when the delegates, the leaders of the states, decided to change the articles because they were not working, because the states were already experiencing uprisings. There was farmers' discontent due to taxes because the states were trying to come up with revenues to pay for foreign dues, and that led again to another meeting in Philadelphia in 1787. Another constitutional convention was summoned in that year for 55 delegates, again, that will meet in Philadelphia to initially revise the Articles of Confederation, but they ended up writing a whole new document, a whole new constitution in which they now created a federal republic. And so it's a federation, it's no longer a confederation, it's actually now a federation that united now all of the 13 states together under the leadership, under the authority of a federal state, again, federal government. Which we examine, of course, all the features of that federal system, distribution of powers between the local, the state, and the federal. There's a distribution of powers. There's a division of powers at the federal level, legislative, executive, and judicial branches. Again, we looked at that quite extensively. And we also looked at the political system that this new federation was going to have. Again, it's a republican system of government, in which now the citizens of the republic are going to be governed by representatives. People will choose representatives to lead them at the local level, at state and federal level, again. So people are not going to be ruling directly. This is not popular democracy where people have to be engaged all the time in meetings, in assemblies, etc., but rather just choosing a representative for that representative to actually do that job or that work for the people, to represent the interest or the will of the people. Again, and so again, this is a republic because also that entails that only those that own property, the educated class, if you will, were going to be the representatives. That under a republican system of government, it is the wise, the philosophers, the educated class that are the ones that are going to actually be the representatives. They're the leaders of the society. They're going to be making decisions for the entire nation at the local, state, and federal level. And there's property qualifications for voting and holding office. So to run for office, you need to own property, because the assumption was more than likely, if you own property, you're educated, that is to say, or if you're voting as well, those that will be allowed to vote and choose their representatives will also have to meet property qualifications. They have to own property, etc. Again, so that's what a republic is. Is really a system of government in which people are ruled by representatives, but the representatives themselves are the educated class. Again, the so-called philosophers or wise, that not necessarily philosophers, but rather that they have a certain degree of education that will enable them to make rational choices and be able to analyze society, analyze the economy, etc., and be able to actually use their rational mind, rational thought to solve problems in the world of society, the economy, etc. So, we looked at the process of ratification. By 1788, 1789, the Constitution was actually ratified by most of the states. Okay. And so now we arrive to a point in which the Republic has been formed. So we cover that quite thoroughly in two separate sessions. Now let's move into the second part. So first part was creating a nation. The second part is going to look at the challenges of the new republic, the challenges of the new American Republic. So we're only going to cover all the way to 1815. Okay, 1815, because it was during those initial years. Those were actually very critical, very crucial, because this is a whole new country that is on the rise. Again, this is something different from the typical political communities around the world, in which the vast majority of human beings actually live in kingdoms or in chiefdoms, but not in republics. They don't live in nations. So this is the first, again, nation, that is going to distinguish itself from the rest of the world, in that this is a sort of like an experiment, if you will. Okay, so and as it's because it's something new, it will face significant challenges during the initial decades of its existence. Challenges that were so severe that for a great number of countries around the world that emerged much later on, particularly when we look at, for example, the 20th century. Many countries, as they were transitioning from being, for example, colonies to become nations, it was a process of this transition of building a nation has been increasingly difficult. Newborn nations face increasing and dramatic problems every day. Again, ever since their form, there's a lot of forces that are at stake that destabilize, if you will, those new nations. And in the United States was no exception, by the way. So let's look at some of those challenges to kind of understand how the American Republic endeavored to survive and maintain its national unity, its national integrity, okay, during the initial years. So this is an exercise, again, that actually is very educational, because it actually serves to understand what all other nations around the world, that are attempting to create a nation that, what they also can, might go through as well. In other words, what actually typically affect nations as they're trying to build a state, build a country. Okay. So this is part two, and there's going to be two challenges I will actually elaborate on. The most important challenges that the American Republic faced. I will explain them in this third session. The first of those challenges was the challenge to maintain and create national unity. Okay, because up to this point, the concept of the nation is brand new. So even though the Constitution has just created a nation, it had unified all the states under a national, what they call federal. Federal or national is almost synonymous, not identical, but it's a very similar concept. So all the 13 states have become one, so to speak, okay, because they're now governed, they're led by a national government, a national state. This is the federal level of authority, that is to say. So despite that fact, the idea of the nation itself was brand new, that this idea had to be grounded in the real world. It was just an idea. The nation, we called the United States at this time, it was an idea, okay? It was a vision, okay, that the framers of the Constitution had, and they had to actually crystallize that idea and make it real, okay? So what I'm actually referring at here is that still up to this time, the people living in the United States were still very much identified with their states. Okay, they understood that they're living now in the United States, that it's a large country, etc. But most people living around this time are still very much loyal. They're very attached emotionally to their own localities, to their own state. So people in Virginia see themselves as Virginians, people in New York as New Yorkers. You go case by case again, and people identify themselves as members of their states. They understand that there's now this new concept, the United States of North America, but they're not necessarily all united. Okay, that people don't feel themselves, for example, as Americans. Okay, the way we speak of today, for example, that we are all Americans, etc. Well, that concept, that national identity, has not yet taken form or taken root, and not even in the 1790s. Again, in the first initial years of the Republic. So it will have to be forged. It will have to be created. It will have to be molded, if you will. What does it mean to be an American, for example? Okay, so what kind of values do we represent? What is our identity? What does it mean? Again, the United States. Again, where is the identity of this country? What is it? And so that is very useful for bringing people together to create a common identity. That is to say, because there's people that are so different ethnically, they're different culturally, they're different religiously. They have different ways of looking at the world, different belief systems, etc. So what is going to be the common thread, in other words, that is going to unite all of people? Okay, what kind of identity can actually bring people? Well, we need a national identity, something that will identify us ourselves as Americans, that is to say, as citizens of the United States. So what are those ideas going to be? And this is exactly what the first presidential administration, George Washington, faced, and all the subsequent presidents as well. Again, every president will have to, in a certain sense, be able to mold or foster certain values, certain principles, certain ideas that can actually bring people together as Americans. Again, so this is going to be an ongoing process. Okay, it's a never-ending process. We can perhaps say that. So George Washington, when he was inaugurated president on April 30th of 1789, he faced that particular challenge. What is going to be our identity? Because we need to unite. Okay, because we just came from a colonial experience, and every colony was pretty much independent. Under the Articles, likewise, the states were very much independent, but now we're united. And so, what is going to be our identity? This is a new nation. Okay, this is the birth of the first nation state in world history. Is the first nation state, by the way. Okay, so people are not subjects. Okay, the way, for example, in Europe, people identify themselves as subjects. We're the subject of King Louis of France, for example, or King George of England. People are subjects of kings, but here in the United States, people are citizens. Okay, we are American citizens. We are citizens of this United States. This is the nation that we live under now. Okay, it's not a kingdom. We're not governed by a monarch, but rather by a nation. We're living in a nation governed by a state. There's a state. Okay, there's a federal state. Okay, that represents us all. Okay, so this is the new identity. Citizens. This is going to be a new identity on the rise as well. The idea that people are citizens, in other words, of a state. Okay, but the United States, as any newborn nation, okay, when you look at the rise of nation states, the United States was the first nation state, by the way, in world history was the first. And after the United States, there will be a host of other countries that are also moving into nationhood. They're transforming their kingdoms into nations as well. Okay, so one of the first challenges that any newborn nation faced, just like the United States did initially, was what is going to be our identity, our national identity. Okay, so we understand that we're citizens. Okay, we're not subjects. Okay, because we don't live in a kingdom. We're citizens because we live in a nation. We're citizens of a nation called the United States. But what is our common identity? What is our national identity? Okay, what does it mean to be a citizen of the United States? In other words, okay, that's what a national identity. What is the identity of this nation? And this is something again that is quite natural in human beings. To search for identity. This is something that we experience, something that we go through in our development as human beings, what we call human development. Okay, so we're born into the world, okay, and we take on initially the identity of our caregivers, okay, our parents, for example, okay. Their identity becomes ours, okay, because they're the ones that are taking care of us, they're the ones that educate us, and we spend most of the time with them. So we take on the identity of the mother, the father, etc. We dress the way they dress us, and we eat what they feed us, etc. And the like. So we kind of take on the identity of our parents until we reach the state of adolescence or independence. That is to say, we declare independence when we become adolescents because we're becoming our own persona. We start really discovering our own personality, what we like, what we don't like, etc. We develop our own tastes on food, on dress, music, etc. that might not be in tune with the ones of our parents. So we declare independence, like, oh, look, I'm my own being, I'm my own person, and I just want to really create my own identity. You start pretty much departing from the ways of your parents in many ways. You might retain some elements again of your parents. It's true, the musical taste perhaps, or certain foodstuffs that are traditional. It is true, but then you start pretty much dressing the way you want. Again, you want to dress based on perhaps how other people dress, your peers, your friends, role models you see, for example, outside in society, people that are successful, people that are famous, rock stars, etc. It doesn't matter, but you start looking at other people for examples, as a model of how we can be, how we can dress, how we can talk, how we can comb our hairs, etc. We start pretty much copying other people because we're looking for identity, in other words, because we're declaring independence from our parents. And the United States was going through the same process. During the colonial period, the colonies were like children of the mother country. Okay, Great Britain was the mother country, was the mother. It was the mother culture. It was the decision maker. It was writing laws for the colonies, etc. And so it was the authority, that is to say, just like a parent. Okay, now the process of independence begins, and so the colonies want to go their own way and detach from the mother country and become its own political persona. In other words, we want to create something new, totally apart from Great Britain, etc. Okay, so now that those colonies have become independent and they have become a nation that is independent, this newborn nation is looking for identity. Okay, so this is something that newborn nations go through. It's a natural process. People searching for identity, nations searching for identity as well. What does it mean to be American? In other words, okay. And so, likewise, this newborn nation is looking for a role model. Who are we going to imitate? Who are we going to follow? What American culture is going to be like? For example, are we going to be, for example, following the culture of the mother country? In other words, is American culture going to be English culture, and we're going to speak English? This is going to be the national language. Follow English norms, traditions. Or is it going to be something else? And of course, there was also the possibility of following German culture, because at least 50% of the population of the United States at this time were German immigrants. There's a large sector of society that are German, and they speak the German language, by the way. So right now, at this point in time, the United States was bilingual. Okay, meaning that a great portion of the population spoke English and German. Okay, even in certain assemblies, like in Pennsylvania, it was very well known that in assemblies, people will speak English and will speak German. They had to, because people were bilingual. Again, they had to understand each other, etc., speak two languages at once. So it was actually on the table. George Washington actually had to decide what was going to be the official language of the United States. Is it going to be English or German? Okay, that was even discussed, by the way, because that will determine what kind of culture we were going to foster after that. Are we going to follow the British or the German culture? Okay. So while this debate was raging on, okay, where people were trying to decide, which role model, which European country we were going to imitate, which European country we were going to emulate. We were carrying the torch again of some European society and culture, etc. Suddenly, again, there's a significant, very dramatic event taking place. This is the same year that George Washington is inaugurated as president. In Europe, suddenly there's going to be another very dramatic event that is going to alter the way people are going to think about nations, about politics, that will alter the way, again, people are going to think about politics forever, not only in Europe, but all over the world. And that is the French Revolution. And the events taking place in France, starting in 1789, are going to make a lot of people consider also France as an example that, while we were looking at Great Britain and Germany as, role models to follow, the events that I'm about to describe, again, that occurred in France, made a significant number of Americans, again, look now at France for inspiration because of the kind of ideas and goals that the French were pursuing in this revolution. Really resonated with millions of people, again, around the world. Okay, not only in the United States, around the world, again, around the world, people that were oppressed, people that were enslaved, people that were living under a feudal system, paying tribute, working for a landlord, etc., that were subordinated, if you will, under a church or a monarchy or landowners, and they were pretty much oppressed. The French Revolution pretty much announced the beginning of a new age in which the ideals of the revolution was to pretty much set free all of the people that were oppressed, in other words. Okay? And that's exactly what the French were attempting to accomplish, really a new state. They wanted a revolution to end all of the oppressive political institutions of France and create a republic. They wanted to create, just like the United States, they wanted to create a republic, a representative republic as well, in which the citizens were going to be taken into account, citizens will be given rights, and citizens will be able to vote, hold office, and be free of all of the oppressive institutions of the past, like the church, the monarchy, and the landowning class, the landowners, the nobility, we call them. Okay, so again, this was a very, very dramatic, moment in world history, and this is taking place in Europe, particularly. Again, this is in France, and this is also going to inspire, people in the United States for actually trying to follow the French example, the French ideals, that maybe we need to, adopt, appropriate some of the ideas of the French revolutionaries, so the United States can also carry on the example of the French, in that maybe what we need to also be is a nation that is going to fight for liberty, to fight oppression and the like. Again, that was the whole, notion. Now, let me explain again. The French Revolution, without actually just, delving so much, but just going through the essentials of what the French Revolution was, in other words, and how this is going to inspire Americans, a great number of Americans, to actually, again, adopt some of the ideas of the French revolutionaries. So the French Revolution, really, just like the American Revolution, was really the byproduct of the Enlightenment ideas that we discussed in the past when we were talking about the American Revolution. Talking about political representation and natural rights. Okay, those are the two main ideas, again, that drove the American independence movement, the American Revolution of 1776, that the British colonies fought for against Britain, because the colonies wanted to be represented in the state. They wanted a recognition, for being, actually peoples that have rights, that, because human beings are born with rights of life, liberty, and property, they wanted, again, a state that will protect or guarantee those rights as well. Okay. And it is particularly those two ideas that are going to drive also the French Revolution as well. Okay. The same ideas that influence the American Revolution will be the same ideas that are going to influence the French. And of course, the French produced the philosopher that actually wrote extensively about this ideal state, about political representation and natural rights. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, he's French. He wrote The Social Contract, and this book became really widely read among the intellectual circles of France, that actually altered the way the French actually thought about the state, about politics, the social contract. They really wanted to create a representative form of government in which there will be a contract between the government and the governed. That is to say, a social contract. And the social contract is that the people will be represented in the state. That's part of the contract. That's part of the agreement. Look, there's going to be a representation, again, of interests, representation of values. People will be totally represented. People will be able to elect their representatives as well into office. There will be a system of elections, etc. And people will have rights. And the state is also responsible for protecting those rights, life, liberty, and property. That's the contract. That's the contract that binds the state together and the people, in other words. So again, those ideas were circulating in France. They were widely disseminated. The intellectuals, the philosophers, the educated class read about them. And of course, they're thinking about creating a new state in France. And of course, the French Revolution is also going to be largely inspired by the American Revolution. That the fact that the 13 colonies of North America fought for their independence against Britain, that also served as an inspiration to the French, that what the Americans just accomplished, they freed themselves from Great Britain and they created this republic. They said, that's exactly what we need to do as well. We need to also create a republic. We need to end the monarchy, okay? And we need to institute a new state, okay, a French republic, and bring about this political representation, this system of political representation in which people will be able to actually elect their representatives as well. There will be elections, etc. Again, this is exactly the ideal state. We want also to create that kind of government, that kind of country. We don't want to live under a kingdom anymore or a monarchy. We want to become part of a republic, that is to say. So even the American Revolution served as an inspiration for the French Revolution that is about to ignite in 1789. And that is the same year when George Washington is actually inaugurated. All right, so it is precisely again in the 1780s where the French masses are coming together to demand political representation. Okay, so um, there are a number of peoples in France, okay, that are not really represented in the state, and that includes peoples like, for example, peasants, merchants, artisans, journeymen that were called people working for a daily pay, etc. And all of them are treated pretty much as commoners. They're called commoners. They're simply the masses, and they have to pay tribute to three kinds of institutions. They have to pay tribute to the monarchy, they have to pay tribute to the church, and they have to pay tribute to the nobility, the landowners. Okay, and each of those three governing institutions are simply uh, extracting labor, extracting resources from the masses, the commoners, that is to say, without representation. In other words, that people don't have a say necessarily, how much taxes they're going to pay, etc. They have to pay for those taxes, that is to say. But because now there's new ideas in the air, okay, about the social contract, the ideal state in which the state provides political representation to the people, take people into account whenever laws need to be enacted or taxes need to be enacted, that the state will have to take into account the general population. So the French masses are demanding now representation precisely in a time when there's ongoing droughts in the 1780s. There's ongoing droughts, crop failure after crop failure. And that the finances of the French monarchy, again, are in shambles because it had fought so many wars in the past. Again, it had fought the British over 5 or 6 times in the past. They were kicked out of North America, the French. They lost Canada. They lost the Ohio Valley, etc. So they don't have an empire. They're on their way out, or so they think. And so they need to come up with taxes. They need to raise taxes and revenues as quickly as possible. But there's ongoing droughts taking place in the 1780s. And nonetheless, they go ahead and begin to pretty much tax the masses without representation, while people are starving, by the way. And as people are unable to pay those taxes, so those dues, those taxes must accrue, they must accumulate. So the following year, you now have a debt that there will be taxes to be paid the following year, plus the ones that you owe from the previous years that you didn't pay. So there's a debt, growing among the masses again. So again, this is going to lead to the conditions for a revolution. People are in total desperation, they're starving, and they're not totally taken into account. So finally, the masses revolt against those three institutions that are extracting taxes, that are oppressing, again, the masses. Again, the monarchy, represented by King Louis XVI, the nobility, the feudal landowners, again, those are the landowners that collect tribute from the masses in terms of labor and products, and the church. The church also is a great landowner in France and also collects tribute as well. Okay, but at this time, again, the people are so exasperated, they're fed up that when they request now the creation of an assembly, they want to create like a Congress, for example. They want to take a vote on taxes. They want reforms. They want to change the system. King Louis XVI pretty much denies any attempt to create a new state. And it is precisely in 1789 when now in the city of Paris, the masses are now in total revolt against the king, against the nobility, and against the church, by the way. Okay, there's riots. Most of those riots are food riots. People are scrambling for food. And also, they're trying to free a lot of the prisoners from a military fort or garrison known as the Bastille, in which many of the prisoners that were there were actually people that were unable to pay their feudal dues, and they were thrown into prison. Okay, again, and many of them had debts. In other words, feudal debts that they refused to pay, and they were sent to prison. They freed all of the prisoners. They stormed this garrison called the Bastille, and they pretty much released a lot of the muskets and the gunpowder, and they pretty much started now. They pretty much ignited the revolution itself, forcing the king to make concessions to allow now the French revolutionaries to create now a representative form of government. So King Louis XVI was against the wall, because now the city of Paris is pretty much in a state of total revolt. It's an uprising, and so he has to make concessions. So he allows now the revolutionaries to create what is called a national assembly. And the purpose for this assembly was to send, invite delegates from all over France to create a new state, to create a new government, that is to say. Okay. And so there's going to be, a lot of delegates that are beginning to arrive there. And it's almost like a continental congress. When we talk about the continental congress, in the colonies, it's also like a forum. It's a political body that is going to be now representing all of the regions of France. There's delegates arriving because they want to have a say in bringing about the new state of France, in other words. Okay, so suddenly what we're going to see is that this assembly took place inside, like in a theater, so to speak. Okay, and so there were seats, of course, all over, and people began to divide themselves, in this different sectors or wings, if you will, okay, of the theater. So in the right wing of the theater, there were all of the representatives of the monarchy sat there. The representatives of the monarchy, the representatives of the nobility, the representatives of the church sat in the right wing, again, in this National Assembly. And the representatives of the left wing were those that came from the merchant class, the intellectuals, the revolutionaries, the philosophers, and the like, that wanted a state of total equality. They really wanted to abolish the monarchy. They wanted to abolish the church, etc. They wanted radical change. They were known as the radicals, and they sat in the left wing. Okay? So this is where we're going to have this terminology of being right wing and left wing. And it's the French Revolution that actually started that, that terminology. The right wing were the monarchists, and the left wing were the liberals. The monarchists were the conservatives. They were the conservatives because they wanted to conserve the old political system. They wanted to conserve the old institutions. Okay, they wanted to conserve the church. They wanted to conserve the monarchy, the nobility. Okay, they wanted to preserve that. And of course, the left wing were known as the liberals. They wanted to liberate people, free them from those institutions. Okay, to create a new state in which people were not going to be paying tribute to the church or to the nobility, etc. They wanted radical change to take place. Again, so after a series of negotiations, and there's going to be a lot of debate and arguments and fights, finally, by 1791, they write a new constitution. Okay, they write a whole new constitution in which they create a whole new government, a new state for France. France is no longer a kingdom. By 1791, the National Assembly now presents the final draft. They create what is called the Republic, the French Republic. It's a new French Republic in which they abolish feudalism. Okay, in other words, nobody's going to pay tribute anymore. That's feudalism. People pay tribute in the form of labor, in the form of resources, to the church, to the king, to the nobility. That's not going to happen, they said. All feudal debts, All feudal dues are going to be abolished. Nobody's going to pay any of those dues because now everybody is a citizen now. Okay? Everybody is now a citizen of this new nation of France, of this republic. We're all French, and we're French citizens of the republic. Okay, so nobody is going to be privileged from now on. Okay, there will be no more aristocracy. An aristocracy is a land-owning class that has privileges by birth, that they inherit their lands. They have entitlements to large estates, again, large tracts of land, palaces and the like, because of their family, because they descend from noble lineages. That idea, again, of people actually inheriting a special status because they come from special lineages, that is abolished. We're here now all the same. We're all citizens, in other words. We're just citizens of the republic, okay? No special privileges, okay? And also the separation of church and state. That the church, again, will have to now be totally separated from the functions of the state. There will be no state church, no state religion. People who are going to believe whatever they want to believe. Again, freedom of religion and the like. Nobody will pay tribute to the church, by the way. Okay, so this is a radical departure from the old order. Again, even though they preserved the monarchy was a secondary figure now, because now the true state of France is going to be the National Assembly, like a Congress, in other words, that all power is now vested in this assembly, that this is the legislative body. This is the body that actually writes laws for France. The king is going to be there, but the king is like a secondary figure that is not going to be the leader of France anymore. It is the National Assembly, and is really led by representatives. Okay, people are going to be electing the representatives to send them to the National Assembly to represent the interests of the people, that is to say. Now this is the new government. Okay, this is the new government of France, of the French Republic. So this is, again, a very radical, departure from the past. Granting equality to all people. What that means is that not that everybody is going to earn the same, but that everybody will be treated equally before the law. There will be no special courts, for the nobility, special courts for the monarchy, special courts for the church. That if you violate any law of France, that there will be the same court, a civil court, equal for everybody. In other words, equality. And people are going to have rights. Okay, they're going to introduce a Bill of Rights in which people are going to be granted as well rights, the rights to life, liberty, and property as well. Again, the rights of man, it was called. This document was actually titled that, the rights of man. Okay, so again, this is really, again, quite radical, considering that France has always been governed by the monarchy, by the church, and the nobility. Again, so again, now the people are in control. They want equality. They want rights. They want a representative form of government. They're diminishing the monarchy altogether. Of course, King Louis XVI rejects the revolution. He's totally against this new development. He thinks that this is not happening. Again, this is really an illusion. So he's trying to flee France in order to actually go and ask his family members, his cousins in Austria, the monarchs of Central Europe and Austria, to invite a foreign army into France to put an end to the French Revolution, to restore the power of the monarchy. Louis XVI was a firm believer of the divine rights of kings, that his right to rule was given to him by God. And so what people were doing, again, this idea that people were now in control of their political institutions, that writing laws, that this is not really consistent with God's law, okay? Because he was the representative of God on earth, in other words, divine rights of kings. So he tries to flee, and as he's trying to escape France, he will be arrested, and he's trying to flee with his family, so they're going to be brought to Paris. And as his plan is revealed, he's going to be tried for treason, treason against France, treason against the new nation, the new republic, and treason against the revolution. and so he's going to be executed in 1793, along with his family as well, in the public square. They're going to be actually beheaded, that is to say. But by that time, when the execution of King Louis happens, now there's foreign armies marching into France. The monarchies of Europe are horrified at what just happened to Louis XVI. The monarchies in Europe, particularly the cousins of Louis the 16th, want to put an end to the revolution in France, because if this revolution spills over into other places of Europe, then the monarchies will come to an end. They fear that their own peasants, that their own people are going to rise up against them and behead them as well. Okay, so they see that there's too much radicalism, taking place in France. That this is just way too much, anarchy, too much power seized by the people, and that the people are simply drunk with power. That is to say, and they're pretty much going against their institutions. And as monarchical armies are marching into France, again, the leaders of the French Revolution, of the National Assembly, have to now empower somebody, again, to actually start preparing for this foreign invasion that is coming to France. So they empower Robespierre. Okay, Robespierre is the one that actually, one of the liberals, he was a radical, by the way. He actually seizes power, he seizes control of the revolution, and because now there are monarchies marching towards France, he needs to pretty much just put an army together. So there's forced conscriptions, like a draft, in other words. People have to defend the republic because the enemies are coming, etc. All of that. And as he seizes power, he's going to bring about what is called a reign of terror. He's going to start executing people right and left that he suspected were working with the monarchies, that they were suspected to be working with Great Britain or be working with the Austrian monarchs, etc. The enemies of the revolution, that is to say. So 30,000 people will be beheaded under the government of Robespierre. This is called the Reign of Terror, because the city of Paris was covered in blood as the guillotine, this device that was really, executing people by actually removing their head again, was actually working day in, day out again during Robespierre's reign. And people were so terrified again to live under his reign because, again, he pretty much suspected that everybody was an enemy, etc., pretty much executing enemies right and left again. So, again, this is where the revolution just goes too far. In other words, the French Revolution takes a wild turn and becomes so radical that now people are dying by the thousands. Okay, the people that were supposed to be working against France or working against the revolution were executed. In other words, 30,000 people. This was the extreme radical phase of revolution. Okay, and at this point, Great Britain has to step in and declares war on France. Okay, by this time, Great Britain feels that it was now time to put an end to this radicalism. That is to say, that what the French were doing was going beyond, way beyond, of simply trying to bring a new state, to bring about reforms, grant people's rights, because now the most radical wing, again, of the liberals have seized power, and they were, again, pretty much executing, thousands of people in the public square of Paris, and that could potentially inspire revolutions elsewhere, like in Great Britain, for example. The British are afraid of that their own people will be inspired by that violence and rise up against the British Parliament, etc. So all of the monarchies, again, of Europe were also very terrified of that prospect, that what is going on in France can potentially happen in some other place again, in Europe or around the world. So the outcome, of course, of this now, the French Revolution, is that Americans will become increasingly divided over the French Revolution, and now this new war between Great Britain and France, because now Great Britain is declaring war on France, and now there's going to be a new war with the British. The French and the British are once again in another war. Okay, and Americans, as they're trying to come together and create a national identity, okay, they're going to become more and more divided over the French Revolution because some Americans actually favor the French Revolution. They really looked at the French revolutionaries with a great deal of romanticism. They romanticize the French Revolution. Like, here we are, they will say, oh, French people that were oppressed for centuries, finally they're rising up and they're fighting their oppressors. They're fighting the king, they're fighting the church and the nobility. Oh, how noble of them. There will be Americans that will actually say that. That there's, yeah, of course, there's a lot of people dying, but that's what a revolution is, in other words. So there were people that were actually sympathetic to the French Revolution and people that were horrified. Okay, some people will say, no, this is really an excess. This is what happens when people lose control of themselves, seizes power, and they don't control their emotions, their anger, and they start pretty much destroying everything, destroy human lives, etc. Again, so again, this division was best expressed with the rise of political parties in the United States. Okay, we're going to see the rise of political parties. Suddenly, we're going to see political parties on the rise, parties that are created based on the French Revolution. Either party, one party is going to favor the French Revolution and side with France, and the other party rejected the French Revolution and instead sided with Great Britain. Again, so that's exactly, we're going to see the rise of the two-party system in the United States. Okay, the two-party system is born with the French Revolution. One party is going to favor the kind of political culture of Great Britain that they said is very stable. It was called British Republicanism, like the British Parliament. It's very stable, very sound. There's, people know how to actually conduct themselves, in a very civilized manner. Britain, we should imitate Great Britain. This party said we need to create a British culture in the United States, while the other party said, no, what we need to do is create a democracy, just like France. France is actually undergoing a dramatic, very radical kind of democratic revolution. This is a democratic revolution, in other words. So that's exactly what we need, in other words. Okay, we need to emulate, we need to imitate the French, the ideals of liberty, the ideals of equality, in other words, and that the people should be in control of their destinies. So we see now the creation of the two-party system, and there's, of course, advantages and there's disadvantages to having political parties, by the way. But the disadvantages is that political parties often divide people. Precisely when people are trying to come together, that people divide themselves politically because they endorse different political parties that have different visions for what the country needs to be. That's what a political party is. It is a political organization that proposes a certain path for moving forward, a certain vision for the future of a country, how to build a country, what kind of economic system, what kind of political system this country needs to have. Okay, that's what a party is. It's trying to shape the economic structure, the political structure of a country. And the United States is going to become increasingly divided between two different ways of looking at the United States moving into the future, the two-party systems. On one hand, you have the Federalists, of course, the Federalist Party, that were horrified at the French excess, the French radicalism, and they instead, the Federalists were looking at Great Britain for inspiration. They said, we need to imitate the British in every possible way because that will actually create political stability in the United States. Okay, social order. Okay, that's very important. We just came from this Daniel Shays Rebellion in Massachusetts. Look what happened there. The farmers' radicalism, in other words, seizing public buildings, etc. The angry mob. No, that's not what we want. Look at France. The angry mob is now beheading people right and left. That's not what we want. Okay, we want social order, and we want private property to be respected as well. We want that the possessions of others be respected. Okay, they want strong federal institutions. Okay, they want, for example, they want a standing army, of course, to maintain order, a navy for foreign trade, and also they want a national bank. Now, in other words, that's what the Federalist Party actually wants to create. Again, strong federal institutions like the U.S. Army, Navy, and a national bank. Okay, most of the Federalists are actually headquartered in New England. Again, the Federalist Party, the base of the Federalist Party is in New England, Massachusetts, Connecticut, New Hampshire, for example. And they really favor, a British culture. They want the United States to become just like Great Britain. Okay, this is the kind of identity that we need. As I said, okay, we need, a British culture, a British identity, and of course, this is a political party that favors this classical republicanism that I've been speaking about of Plato, a political system in which the educated class, the people with property, are the ones that will be the leaders, the representatives. So instead of allowing the masses to participate, what they say, no, what we need is, a republic in which the educated class, people that have a vested interest in society, property, that own property, they're the ones that should be the representatives, the senators. They should be the governors, the mayors, etc. The educated class, in other words. This is going to provide a very sound, very stable society. And on the other hand, those that sympathized with the French Revolution created another party that will be known as the Democratic Republicans. Okay, I know this sounds like an oxymoron, because today the Democratic Party and the Republican Party are pretty much separate. But the Democratic Republicans are simply the forerunners of the present-day Democratic Party, the party of today, the Democratic Party. Okay, whereas the Federalists are the forerunners of the Republican Party, actually. Okay. So let's just call them the Democrats, okay? The Democrats, again, we call Democratic Republicans. They were the supporters of the French Revolution. People like Thomas Jefferson and James Madison from Virginia. They created this party in 1794. They gave rise to this party, okay? Because what they wanted was a society that is going to actually empower people to actually have rights to vote, to hold office. Even people without property, they said, they should be taken into account. This is what's called the Jeffersonian ideal of a democratic republic. Okay, it says, yes, let's create a republic, but let it be a democratic republic in which people are going to be in control of their own laws, in their own cities, in their own towns, in the states, and the people are going to be the leaders, in other words, okay? A democracy, that is to say. It's called popular democracy. Because what's important, more than social order, is liberty and equality, okay? Yeah, social order is important. You have to have stability, of course. But what Jefferson was arguing is that it is more important to have a society in which people enjoy liberty and equality. Like the French. The French are fighting for liberty and equality. That's exactly what we need, he said. That the common man needs to be taken into account. Not only the educated class, not only the property owners, okay, not only people that are highly educated, but rather that the common man is also, again, needs to be taken into account. Even the simple person in the street, in other words, the simple farmer, somebody that is not really prominent, that have high status or education, that person should be taken into account as well. So again, this is giving rise to the first political organization that over time will be known as the Democratic Party. Again, Thomas Jefferson and Madison actually created it. Okay, so the base of support of the Democratic Party were the farmers, the farming societies, particularly in the Western territories. As people are moving west, they're self-governed, because they don't have political institutions. They don't live in states, they live in territories, and they're self-governed. The farmers in the Western territories, they pretty much are the leaders of their own communities. So they're creating democracy again in the West. Again, so they're going to be the ones that are going to be voting Democrat, as well as the farmers in the South as well. Okay, Southern farmers as well, they're going to be actually voting Democrat as well. They are following the French ideals of democracy and equality. Okay, that over time, by 1833, we're going to see is that the Democratic Party abolished property qualifications for voting and holding office. By 1833, once again, it was the Democratic Party that says we need to end this strict Republican form of government in which only property owners participate. They removed those property qualifications, and now voting rights was granted to all landless whites in this case, okay, across the board. Okay, so by 1833, the United States becomes a democracy. Okay, by 1833, because there's now a political organization that is actually favoring, again, the common man, so to speak, to participate in politics as well. Okay, so that was the first, again, challenge, is that as people are trying to come together and create national unity, to create a national identity, suddenly the French Revolution, creates a condition for the rise of political parties in the United States, and people become, of course, very divided politically between the Federalists and the Democrats. So the second challenge I want to discuss here is the new American Republic faced another challenge besides the political divisions, created by the French Revolution, and that was the challenge to maintain free trade and expand westward. This is something that affected the colonies prior to independence. The British Navigation Acts ended the free trade system of the colonies and prohibited the colonies from moving westward. That's why the colonies declare independence, by the way. Now that we see an independent United States, those ideas, whether the United States could maintain its free trade system and expand westward, was tested, okay, during those initial years of the Republic, okay? And precisely this new republic faced enormous challenges to maintain free trade and expand westward because of the wars between France and Great Britain. Those new wars between France and Great Britain are going to, in a certain way, prevent the United States from actually trading freely and moving westward, because the American Republic will be caught in the crossfire of those new French-British wars that are raging on, particularly in Europe from 1793 to 1815. And because the United States was in the middle, if you will, of that conflict, the ability to engage in free trade and move westward was greatly affected. And as we'll see, there will be yet another conflict. The United States is going to fight another war with Great Britain, the so-called War of 1812. This is something that we're going to actually pay attention to in this segment, in this second challenge. Okay, so let us look at the background, of course, of this challenge, of course. Well, when it comes to free trade, the United States, of course, ever since the very first day of George Washington's presidency in office, was that we need to engage in free trade, because this is the number one factor that is going to sustain the American economy. Okay, trade itself, the ability for the United States to export goods to the outside world, particularly to Europe and the Caribbean islands. Okay, the United States started out with an export-based economy. Okay, started out that way. This is based an economy based on exports. So if we're going to have prosperity in the country, it is because of the amount of goods that producers in the United States, whether cattle ranchers or farmers, for example, or plantation owners, etc., will be able to export to the world. and that is going to bring capital. In other words, there's going to be monies flowing into the country because of those exports. So that was the idea. We need to be totally neutral, but the new conflicts between France and Great Britain, again, are going to affect U.S. neutrality, okay, and free trade, because, as we'll see, as the United States is attempting to engage in free trade and export products to Europe, both the French and the British will be affecting American ships. American cargo ships will be seized, as we'll see, on the high seas by the French and the British alike, because they're at war. Okay, so again, the United States functions under a strict, again, export-based economy during this time. It's an economy based on exports, exporting things like cotton, wheat, tobacco, for example, lumber as well, cattle, and the like, again, fish. So this is, again, what American producers, are actually engaged in, and the ability for those producers to ship out those products will determine whether the American economy will be doing well in any particular year, whether families are going to have monies and producers are going to increase their profits, etc., whether there's going to be an increasing number of money circulating in the economy. It's all based on exports, by the way. Exports with Europe and the Caribbean. Again, Europe and the Caribbean are the main customers right here, again, of U.S. products, of American exports, that is to say. So George Washington understands very clearly that if we're going to maintain and develop and grow an economy, it is because of our trade, because of our exports. And so in order to guarantee that we're going to continue in this path of exporting products to the rest of the world, we need to be neutral. In other words, not take sides, not join wars, because that will actually hinder our ability to actually trade with everybody. We want to trade with everybody, in other words. We just want to trade freely with the rest of the world. Okay? So just the exports alone, again, when you look at, for example, the 1790s, they were growing exponentially every year, from 20 million in 1793 to 94 million a year in 1800. So you can see how the growth of the American economy corresponds to the increasing growth of the U.S. exports as well. So, of course, if this new republic, economically speaking, is to function, is to prosper, okay, is to maintain its integrity, it needs a very sound economic system that will allow producers to export. That is to say, we need to protect our export-based economy, and that entails, of course, proclaiming neutrality. That's what George Washington did very early on. The United States is neutral. We're a neutral nation, and so therefore we have the right to trade with everybody. And so in this new conflict in Europe, we have the right to trade with France and Great Britain. In other words, we're not going to take sides, and we're just going to trade with everybody. In other words, we're going to continue sending our products to Europe as usual, and we're not going to participate in that foreign conflict, that is to say. But Great Britain and France were very well aware of the importance of U.S. exports, for their own war efforts. In other words, whoever takes the upper hand, in trading with the United States is going to win the war, because both nations depended on U.S. goods, particularly food products, food products particularly. So they both were so desperate to get the United States to their side, trade-wise, that the only way to actually prevent the rival, the enemy, from actually getting materials from the United States is to actually seize the cargo ships, seize the merchandise on the high seas. So what the French and the British are doing is actually blockading each other's ports, and as American merchant vessels are approaching a British port or a French port, what both are doing is pretty much seizing, again, American cargo ships, again, to prevent them from actually getting those materials, those food products, etc. The British even go to the extent of also seizing American citizens and forcing them to serve in the British Navy. Okay, so I mean, to step further, by the way. Whereas the French, in many cases, they even steal the ship, not just the merchandise, but what the French do is, again, what's called piracy, in that they pretty much seize the entire ship. They steal, you know, even the ship itself, you know. So they raid the ship, they steal the cargo, and they, in many cases, steal the ship in many cases as well. So again, there's a loss of lives, and there's also loss of property, and American trade is being affected, you know, by the French-British War. Okay, so again, this is a situation that George Washington is just unable to deal with, because, again, this is something that is happening in Europe. And as ships are going into Europe to deliver goods, they're now being seized on the high seas as they approach European waters. Okay, so this is the best what he could do is simply proclaim neutrality. That is to say, okay, proclaim neutrality, trying to maintain neutrality, trying to trade with everybody. But that's as much as he could do at that time. He was actually his vice president, who becomes now president of the United States in 1797, that is going to deal then with this situation, trying to maintain free trade by actually creating the U.S. Navy. Okay, so John Adams is a federalist. He wants, sound institutions, and he's pro-British. He's not really sympathetic to the French cause. He's more sympathetic to the British cause. But nonetheless, he is worried so much about the loss of property that many ships are lost on the high seas. So what he's going to do is create the U.S. Navy to escort American vessels, American merchant ships on the high seas to protect them. In other words, that's what the U.S. Navy was created for by John Adams. He's the creator of the U.S. Navy in 1797. He's trying to deal with, this interference, if you will, in free trade by protecting American ships. Okay, and so at some point he tried to negotiate with the French leaders, some form of treaty for the French to actually halt, to stop the piracy, because those were acts of piracy. The French were actually raiding ships, stealing merchandise, and stealing the ship, etc. So he sent a delegation, John Adams, again to France, to discuss the possibility of writing a treaty, reaching a consensus, a deal for the French to stop the piracy. And as the American delegation arrived to France, the ministers of France actually pointed out that the only way that France could stop the piracy is if the United States paid them some form of fee. Okay, so in other words, you have to pay us some money. In other words, bribe. It's a bribery. In other words, pay us a fee every now and then, and if you give us some money, then we can stop the piracy. Okay, that's the only condition. So again, the American delegates pretty much refused to pay those monies or sign any accord, and then when they returned back to the United States, diplomatic relationships with France and the United States were almost broken. The United States and France were almost in a state of war. It's a quasi-war with France, in other words, because of the French piracy, that is to say, that was ongoing, and now they're asking for a bribe, in other words, that, we'll be able to actually stop our piracy only if you pay us, some money, in other words. So, of course, every administration is really dealing with those European wars, and what is at stake, again, is the economy itself, because the American economy depends on exports and trade is being affected by the French and British wars and their policies of seizing cargoes and so on and so forth. So a lot of merchants, a lot of producers are just losing a lot of products. If you're exporting cattle or lumber, all of that is being stolen, again, in Europe, in other words. So now, as we move into the 1800s, this is going to actually escalate further, okay, this situation. is going to escalate further with the so-called Napoleonic Wars. This is going to be new wars that are going to actually expand the conflict in Europe, and American interests will be also greatly affected with the so-called Napoleonic Wars. Again, that began around 1803. Now, very quickly, the Napoleonic Wars began when suddenly France welcomes a new ruler. Okay, it's a French general by the name of Napoleon Bonaparte, who comes to power in 1799, due to the fact that he was elevated to, the hero, savior of France and the savior of the revolution. He was the French general who repelled the monarchical forces from France. He saved the revolution, and he was considered the new hero. So therefore, he's elevated to become now the ruler of the French nation. And he's going to actually be crowned, over time, emperor of France. So they're fighting against monarchy, but suddenly, he declares himself emperor. So again, something weird. So at any rate, so Napoleon seizes power, and what Napoleon is attempting to do is declare war on all the monarchies of Europe. In other words, that he wants to now march into different parts of Europe in order to rally the masses, against their own rulers, so they can actually, change their systems. In other words, to change the monarchy, to seize power, etc., and export the revolution. So again, the French Revolution is being exported by Napoleon. Okay, and he's going to be building a massive force now, massive armies, recruiting people from other kingdoms as he's, quote unquote, liberating them, in other words. Okay, and so more than ever, Great Britain is so now adamant to stop Napoleon, because the British don't trust Napoleon, that he wants to be the liberator of Europe, liberate all peoples from the shackles of the monarchs, etc. The British are very suspicious of that. They feel that Napoleon simply is hungry for power and wants to be the emperor of Europe, in other words. So he has imperial ambitions. So more than ever, Britain is trying to, fight Napoleon and bring an end to the French Revolution more than ever. So the piracy in the high seas is going to intensify. Okay, the British and the French navies, more than ever, are now so convinced that it's so important to prevent each other from actually getting any materials from the United States. Okay, they're seizing now American ships. Both are actually just seizing the ships altogether, not just the merchandise, but the ship as well, because they're now again in a new phase, a new war, the Napoleonic Wars, if you will, and more intense, more than ever. Okay, but in 1800 in the United States, there's now going to be a new president. Okay, and he is Thomas Jefferson. He's the founder of the Democratic Party. It's called Democratic Republican Party, but it's the Democratic Party, by the way. And he's sympathetic towards France, by the way. So he's pro-French, and his policies are going to pretty much mirror that sympathy, if you will, that as John Adams was more pro-British, and he almost broke relationships with France, Thomas Jefferson is going to tilt the scale more in favor of Napoleon and side with Napoleon, in other words. He'll be sympathetic in many cases. But despite that fact, the truth is that both Napoleon and Great Britain are seizing American cargo ships. So he is so desperate to put an end to that interference of free trade that Thomas Jefferson is going to place an embargo, a trade embargo in Europe. It's called the Embargo Act. In other words, that we're not going to send any materials. We're not going to trade with Europe altogether. We're going to stop all trade. That's what the Embargo Act. Okay? We're going to close our ports for the European merchants. So even if the European merchants want to come all the way to North America and pick up the goods, they're not going to be able to do so. And those that are going to be exporting products, they're going to be doing so illegally, and we're actually going to persecute smugglers, that is to say, under the Embargo Act. So what Jefferson wanted to do was to stop all form of trade with Europe, so the French and the British will actually pay attention, to the United States and take the United States into account. Like, you cannot treat us this way, in other words. And because you need our products so much, we're not going to actually send anything. We're not going to send food supplies or anything because you desperately need those. So we're not going to trade with you until you change your policy, until you change completely your policy altogether. But the Embargo Act, what it actually did was that since the American economy was based on exports, it's an export-based economy, it actually hurt the American economy, the Embargo Act. Exports plunged from 146 million in the early 1800s down to 22 million a year. So it's a sharp decrease in the amounts of monies that producers were making from exports. But nonetheless, again, Jefferson is pretty much against the wall. That what else can we do if we just resume trade? We're losing a lot of lives, and we're losing also monies. We're losing actually ships. Entire ships are being seized. So it's a lose-lose situation. So what he wanted to do is save monies, save property, and save human lives as well. So it's very difficult. Again, this is increasingly difficult for any president, again, that is really caught in the crossfires in the middle of a conflict in Europe, again, in which the consumers of American products happen to be Europeans, and this trade is being affected by those Napoleonic wars, and there's very little that they could do. Okay, so merchants and farmers lost a lot of revenues, that they were making every year, and so the Embargo Act is not going to be something so popular, something that people actually supported, and people, of course, will want to see a change of course. All right, so in 1808, we're going to see a new president coming into office. It's another Virginian, a co-founder of the Democratic Party, James Madison. And he's also pro-French. And his way of dealing with the conflict is, just like Jefferson, is dealing with this interference in free trade is going to lead to increasing tensions with Great Britain, and there will be a new war, the so-called War of 1812. Okay, so again, this is something that James Madison is coming into office already with a conflict in Europe that is affecting American interest. There's the Embargo Act that prohibits the United States from trading with France and Britain and all of Europe, by the way, but it's hurting the American economy. So as Madison comes into office, Napoleon, being a general, of course, he's a strategist, he's trying to pit the U.S. against Great Britain, cause problems between those two countries, in other words. And so the way he does this is by announcing that from this point onwards, France will no longer carry out acts of piracy against American ships. Now, look, we're not going to seize any more ships. We're not going to seize your merchandise, etc. We're going to respect your neutrality, your rights to trade, and so on. Because Napoleon knew very well that Great Britain was going to pursue the same, the same policy of piracy of the past, that they were not going to stop the piracy. So Great Britain will appear as to be the only aggressor against the U.S., in other words. Again, it was really a strategy there, manipulation of Napoleon. Because Great Britain continued with the piracy, therefore, Madison announced that we're not going to embargo any more trade in Europe. We're going to continue with trade, but the only nation that we're going to exclude is Great Britain. We're not going to trade with Great Britain until Great Britain changes their course of action. We don't want, of course, to deal with Great Britain as long as the British are seizing our cargo ships, etc. That's exactly what Napoleon actually was looking for, to have diplomatic tensions between those two countries. And of course, those tensions are going to deteriorate to the point that there's going to be a new war. Okay. Well, because the U.S.-British relations are deteriorating because Great Britain continued to seize cargo ships on the high seas, and because there's now news of Indian hostilities in the Northwestern Territories. The Native Americans are rising up in the Northwestern Territories, and there are rumors that the British Canadians, the British in Canada, are the ones actually sponsoring those hostilities. Okay, so again, this is the Northwestern Territories right here: Michigan, Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin. Again, as Americans are moving into this region was contested also by Canada, by Great Britain, and the rumors were that the British in Canada were actually arming the natives there in this region to attack American settlers. And so we got now another situation. Americans want to move westward as well. It's not just the free trade. They want to move westward. But the situation is that in the Great Lakes region, the Indians are rising up against the American settlers, and there are rumors that the British are behind those hostilities. So kind of bringing back the memories of the French and Indian War, in other words. And remember back in the French and Indian War that the French were arming the Indians in the frontier. Okay. There is, of course, a large uprising in 1811 led by the Shawnees, again, that are believed to be with an alliance with the British. There's a British-Indian alliance, the Shawnees. The leader is a prophet by the name of Tecumseh. He uses prophecy, religion to rally the Indians, saying that the time had arrived for the dawn of a new age, again, for the natives, for the restoration of Indian lands, the return of ancient customs and traditions and the like. And of course, the Indians are now fighting the Americans there in the Northwestern Territories, again, the Indiana, etc. territory. So that itself, in 1811, led to a rupture of relationships with the United States. Britain and the United States are now at a low point in diplomatic relations because Madison is convinced that what's really going on is that Great Britain was interfering with free trade and also expanding westward. And he goes to Congress and asks Congress to declare war on Great Britain again in 1812. And this motion won the day, had a great support in Congress, because by this point, the members of Congress, a great many of them were young. Those were actually people that were born already in the independent United States. They were not like Madison, for example, that were coming from the independence from the colonial period. Those were actually very young Americans that saw themselves as Americans, and they were nationalists. They had a grand vision for the United States that that we were born already in a free country, in an independent United States, and we're destined for greatness. They said we need to expand westward, all the way to the west. We need to settle, etc. This is the mission. This is the destiny of the United States, etc. So the leaders of the nationalists were actually known as the war hawks that wanted war, in other words, with Great Britain. People like John C. Calhoun and Henry Clay that were actually pushing. They were very young, members of Congress that really wanted a war. So when they heard Madison for asking for a declaration of war, they suddenly, again, they pretty much convinced all the other members that this is the destiny. Again, this is what needs to be done for expanding not only across the West, but even north, in other words, that maybe what we need to do is fight the British to free Canadians from Great Britain and annex Canada into the United States and build an empire that includes also the northern province of Canada. They were called expansionists. And so they wanted to expel Britain from North America altogether. The war hawks, again, this is how they see this conflict. So they won the day, and they voted in favor for war, and the War of 1812 begins. Again, it's a war that endeavored to, for the perspective of Americans, to free Canada from Great Britain, and also to fight for settling in the western frontier as well, in the northwestern territories. Most of the battles will be fought in the border between the United States and Canada, and in the northwestern territories as well. The vast majority. The aims, very clearly, who's going to control the Great Lakes? Okay, who's going to have entitlements to actually settle there? Okay, the British actually were fighting the Americans by building an alliance with Native Americans. You know, the British Indian Alliance, in other words, they were fighting the Americans there. Okay, in the Great Lakes, they were really trying to dispute: is the Great Lakes part of Canada, or is it just open territory that could be settled by anybody? Again, they were also battling for the control of Canada as a whole. You know, who's going to actually control Canada? Okay, is it going to be a free Canada, independent Canada? Is it going to be part of the United States, or Britain will retain its rights over Canada? And so there were also battles fought also in Canada as well. Okay, and also the aim is, again, for the perspective of Great Britain, is that preventing the United States from trading with France. So Britain took the opportunity to actually blockade American ports on the eastern seaboard in order to prevent ships from sailing out to France to provide aid to Napoleon, in other words. So the War of 1812 was strategic from the perspective of the British in trying to prevent, again, American materials from reaching the enemy, in other words, the French. Now, not everybody, of course, agreed with this war. Okay, so not everybody it was in favor of actually fighting Great Britain. The Federalists of New England believed that this was a mistake. In other words, we're fighting the wrong party here. Okay, that is not Great Britain our enemy, but it's Napoleon. That Napoleon actually tricked us to fight the British, in other words. And so they did not want to join the war. In fact, they wanted to secede from the Union and create a separate republic, the Republic of New England. So they met in 1812 in Connecticut. Okay, it's called the Hartford Convention, Hartford, Connecticut. The Federalists are going to meet there, opposing the war, announcing that they were pro-British, by the way, and that they sided with England, and they wanted secession. They wanted to secede from the Union to create a separate state. In other words, that is going to actually favor the British. That is to say, again, this is again a development taking place, that there's a political party that says, no, we don't favor this. In other words, we're pro-British, so we don't favor the War of 1812. And again, they were sympathetic to the British cause all throughout this conflict, by the way. Okay, so again, this war is not going to last very long. Eventually, it's going to come to an end rather quickly in 1814. There will be a treaty in Belgium, a meeting of delegates from Great Britain and an American sitting there to sign a peace treaty, the Treaty of Ghent, that actually, again, ended up closing this episode, this war, again, with the United States. The British realized that they cannot fight two wars at the same time. They rather fight Napoleon and actually settle disputes with the Americans. The disputes are over borders, the border with Canada and the Northwestern Territories. So again, what the British are saying is that Canada will remain British, and the Northwestern Territories, Michigan, Indiana, Illinois, this is an open territory that Americans can settle. That is to say. And Britain is going to stop all Indian hostilities. In other words, we're not going to incite the natives to attack American settlers, etc. We are hereby, again, pretty much closing that chapter. Okay, so again, the war will still be fought for some time. It will come to an end in 1815 because it took about 3 months for ships to come to the United States from Europe to announce the news of the treaty. In other words, so the outcome of the war is that what the war did is that it actually, for the most part, brought a lot of people together and people saw that the new republic was actually more consolidated than ever. Okay, people saw, because of the War of 1812, because they have to unite, a great many, not all of them, but because they have to unite to fight the British, that this actually helped build a national identity. People are now seeing themselves as Americans, in other words. For the first time, people are calling themselves Americans, that we live in the United States, we're Americans, etc. And there's now a national identity. Okay, this is the first generation to actually be able to visualize the nation. That is to say, the War of 1812 helped people come together, if you will, to actually, develop this idea of nationhood, that we live in an independent nation. The end of the Federalist Party. The outcome of this war is that the Federalist Party, the party that sided with Great Britain and tried to secede from the Union, comes to an end because they sided with the enemy. So, there will be no more Federalists at this point, because they had a bad reputation. And so all the political divisions come to an end for quite a while. The two-party system comes to an end temporarily because the Federalists are no longer, in society. Again, they have to disband, in other words. So again, people are no longer divided, at least for a moment. And of course, the other outcome is that the United States is going to reclaim free trade, and it starts to now move westward at an accelerated rate. The War of 1812 also kind of allowed, if you will, now Americans to, pursue more and more opportunities overseas, try to trade, etc., overseas, and move westward. All the constrictions, all the limitations, come to an end. Now Americans can simply move westward, and that's something that, again, the War of 1812 enabled them to do. Okay, so this is the end of our topic. This is the end of this topic called the New American Republic. That's all I have for you. This was an extended presentation. We have to close this topic. Again, this is the third session. The outlines are on Blackboard. The questions, etc., are still there for you to review. So this is the end, again, of this topic. When we come back for session 1 of the 8th topic, we're going to be looking at the Industrial Revolution. Again, this is for the following session when we come back. Thank you.